Jung's most terrifying discovery wasn't about the shadow or the unconscious. It was about people who absorb others' emotions so completely they lose themselves in the process, and why this ability either breaks them completely or transforms them into emotional healers the world desperately needs. In his private clinical notes from 1919, Jung documented patients with what he called psychological porosity, individuals whose emotional boundaries were so thin they absorbed the feelings, trauma, and unconscious contents of everyone around them. They felt others' depression as their own darkness, experienced strangers' anxiety as physical pain, and carried the collective emotional wounds of entire families without understanding why. Jung called this discovery terrifying because these individuals didn't just empathize, they became emotional repositories for psychological material that others couldn't process. And this unconscious absorption was slowly destroying them from within. Today I'll reveal Jung's most hidden discovery about people who feel everything and why he believed this rare ability either annihilates your identity or transforms you into exactly what humanity needs for psychological healing. The case that revealed Jung's most terrifying discovery. The discovery began with a patient Jung described in his confidential notes, a 34-year-old woman who came to him in 1919 during his own recovery from what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. This patient represented what Jung would later identify as the rarest psychological phenomenon: complete emotional permeability. She couldn't enter a room without feeling overwhelmed by invisible emotional currents. Walking past a hospital made her physically ill from absorbed suffering. Sitting in restaurants became impossible because she felt the relationship tensions, hidden grief, and unexpressed anger of strangers at neighboring tables. Jung wrote, "The patient displays an extraordinary susceptibility to unconscious emotional contents in others. Her psychic boundaries appear non-existent, allowing foreign emotional material to flood her system without discrimination or protection." She described her experience to Jung. "It's as if everyone's unfelt emotions pour into me. I walk through life carrying sorrows that aren't mine, anger that belongs to strangers, fears from people I've never met. I don't know where others end and I begin." This wasn't mental illness. Jung realized he was observing what happens when the normal psychological barriers that protect individual identity become completely dissolved. She was experiencing pure emotional contagion on an unprecedented scale. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. Therefore, he began investigating what he would later term unconscious absorption syndrome, the psychological phenomenon where emotionally porous individuals become living repositories for the unprocessed trauma and shadow contents of everyone in their environment. The psychological mechanics of emotional absorption, Jung wrote in his Red Book period notes, "There are those among us whose emotional bodies are so permeable that they serve as unconscious sewage systems for collective psychological waste. They absorb not merely conscious emotions, but the entire repressed emotional legacy of their families, communities, and culture." Modern neuroscience research on mirror neurons partially validates Jung's early observations. Studies show that some individuals have hyperactive mirror neuron systems that don't just observe others' emotional states, but literally embody them neurologically. But Jung identified something more specific within his psychological typology: the introverted feeling type with undifferentiated boundaries, comprising roughly 3% of the population who don't just feel deeply but unconsciously absorb emotional material that others have rejected or repressed. Jung observed that these individuals have what he called emotional sponge syndrome. Their nervous systems process not just obvious emotional cues, but unconscious feeling states, suppressed traumas, and ancestral emotional patterns that others cannot detect. They feel the family depression that no one acknowledges. They absorb the collective grief from historical traumas. They carry the emotional inheritance of generations who never processed their pain. Jung wrote, "The danger lies not in feeling deeply, but in feeling what belongs to others without conscious discrimination. When one's emotional body becomes a repository for collective unconscious contents, individual identity dissolves into collective possession. This creates what Jung called the problem of the feeling function. When your greatest emotional sensitivity becomes your greatest burden because it connects you to suffering that isn't yours to heal. But Jung discovered the real terror wasn't the absorption itself. Because people who unconsciously absorb others' emotional contents become targets for what Jung extensively documented as emotional dumping, where individuals unconsciously project their unprocessed feelings onto those capable of holding them. The target phenomenon, Jung wrote in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious. Nothing has a stronger unconscious influence on others than unprocessed emotional material. The person who cannot feel their own pain will unconsciously deposit it in those who can. Jung discovered this principle created a devastating pattern. When someone encounters an emotionally porous individual, their unconscious mind recognizes a perfect repository for feelings they can't handle. Without conscious awareness, they begin emotionally dumping onto the sensitive person. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. Emotionally porous patients became magnets for others' unprocessed trauma. Family members would unconsciously discharge their anxiety, depression, and rage onto the sensitive individual, then walk away feeling lighter while the empath became overwhelmed with feelings that weren't originally theirs. Jung realized this wasn't conscious cruelty. It was unconscious psychological survival. The human psyche will always seek to discharge unbearable emotional contents onto those capable of containing them. This is not malice. This is psychological gravity. This creates what Jung called the emotional scapegoat phenomenon. Highly absorptive individuals often become the designated feeling holders in every system they enter. Not because they create problems, but because they unconsciously absorb problems that already exist in the collective emotional field. Jung observed, the bearer of emotional porosity becomes the repository for all that the family or group cannot consciously feel about itself. This pattern explains why these individuals don't just feel overwhelmed, they feel systematically targeted by emotional material that seems to seek them out. They become unconscious waste disposal systems for collective psychological toxicity. But Jung's most terrifying discovery was still to come. Because Jung observed that overwhelming emotional absorption manifested differently in different individuals. Therefore, he identified 4 distinct patterns within emotionally porous types, each representing a different way of processing foreign emotional contents. The 4 types of emotional absorption type. 1. The feeling. Jung documented patients who absorbed others' emotions so completely they reflected them back amplified. These individuals became emotional echo chambers, taking in subtle feelings and broadcasting them intensely. Jung wrote, the feeling mirror experiences others' emotional states more intensely than the originators themselves. They become amplification systems for collective emotional contents that others have numbed or suppressed. They might absorb someone's barely conscious sadness and experience it as devastating grief. They feel others' denied anger as rage. They experience the suppressed fear in a room as panic attacks. Type 2. The emotional translator. These individuals absorbed complex, unconscious emotional patterns and somehow understood their meaning and origin. Jung observed they could identify the source, cause, and healing path for emotions that others couldn't even recognize they were carrying. Jung noted, they possess an uncanny ability to decode the emotional language of the unconscious, understanding not just what others feel, but why they feel it and what it means. Type 3. The somatic absorber. Jung documented patients who absorbed others' emotional states through their physical bodies. They experienced others' depression as chronic fatigue, anxiety as digestive issues, or suppressed anger as inflammatory conditions. Jung wrote, these individuals serve as physical lightning rods for collective emotional disturbances, manifesting in their bodies what others carry in their psyches. Type 4. The ancestral absorber, the rarest type Jung encountered, absorbed not just current emotional contents, but generational trauma and ancestral emotional patterns. They carried the unprocessed grief, fear, and rage of entire family lineages. Jung observed, they become living repositories for emotional inheritance, carrying in their nervous systems the unfelt feelings of ancestors who died without psychological resolution. Understanding your specific absorption pattern is crucial because each type requires different approaches to what Jung called the containment challenge. The three specific terrors Jung identified three specific terrors that made emotional absorption so devastating. Terror. 1. Identity dissolution. Jung wrote, when one's emotional body becomes a repository for others' feelings, the boundary between self and other dissolves. The individual loses contact with their own authentic emotional reality. Jung observed that people who absorb others' emotions often couldn't distinguish between their own feelings and what they'd unconsciously collected. They became so flooded with foreign emotional material that their own emotional truth disappeared beneath layers of absorbed content. Terror. 2. Chronic overwhelm. Most dangerously, Jung found that emotionally porous individuals often lived in states of chronic emotional intensity that had no apparent source. They felt constantly on the edge of breakdown without understanding they were carrying the unfelt feelings of everyone around them. Jung emphasized, the terror is not just social isolation but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual emotional identity in favor of collective emotional possession. Terror. 3. The healing trap. Jung discovered that many emotionally porous individuals became addicted to helping others process emotions. They unconsciously sought out emotionally wounded people, believing they could heal them by absorbing their pain. Jung called this unconscious emotional martyrdom, where the person sacrifices their own psychological health trying to heal others through absorption rather than conscious therapeutic skill. Jung's integration method for emotional absorption. Because unintegrated emotional absorption posed such dangers, Jung developed what he called the conscious feeling process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual emotional identity while developing conscious relationship with foreign emotional contents. Phase 1. Recognition and separation. Jung taught emotionally porous patients to first recognize when they were absorbing emotional material that wasn't their own. He called this emotional discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner feelings and unconsciously absorbed external contents. Jung wrote, the first task is to establish emotional sovereignty, knowing what belongs to your psyche and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual emotional development. Technique. Jung instructed patients to spend time in complete emotional isolation daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic emotional voice. Phase 2. Conscious boundaries. Jung discovered that emotionally porous individuals needed to learn what he called conscious permeability, the ability to choose when and with whom to open emotionally rather than absorbing indiscriminately. Jung wrote, emotional boundaries are not walls. They are conscious membranes that allow healthy emotional exchange while preventing unconscious absorption. This involved developing what Jung called emotional choice points, moments of conscious decision about whether to engage with someone else's emotional content. Phase 3. Transformative service. The final phase involved what Jung called conscious emotional alchemy, the ability to transform absorbed emotional material consciously rather than simply carrying it as burden. Jung wrote, the individuated emotionally porous person becomes a conscious transformer of collective emotional contents, helping to heal collective emotional patterns through conscious processing rather than unconscious absorption. This requires developing what Jung called emotional containers, the ability to hold others' emotional contents temporarily for conscious transformation without losing individual identity. Historical examples of integration versus break down the case of unintegrated absorption. Virginia. Jung studied Virginia Woolf's writings and observed her extraordinary emotional sensitivity. She could feel the emotional currents of London streets, absorb the psychological atmosphere of rooms, and sense the collective emotional state of her era. However, Jung noted that Wolf never learned to distinguish between her own emotional contents and what she absorbed from the collective. Instead of consciously processing absorbed emotional material, she became overwhelmed by emotional contents that weren't originally hers. Jung wrote, Wolf possessed extraordinary emotional porosity, but she remained identified with absorbed contents rather than learning to transform them consciously. The case of integrated absorption. Teresa of Avila. Jung extensively studied the medieval mystic Teresa of Avila, whom he considered an example of successfully integrated emotional porosity. Teresa absorbed the spiritual and emotional anguish of her era, but learned to transform it through conscious spiritual practice. Unlike many emotionally porous individuals, Teresa developed what Jung called mystical discrimination, the ability to feel collective emotional contents while maintaining individual spiritual identity. Jung wrote, Teresa transformed her emotional absorption into spiritual medicine for others. She felt deeply but processed consciously, serving collective emotional healing without losing individual integrity. Jung's personal integration journey. Most significantly, Jung documented his own struggle with emotional absorption during his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919. He wrote in the Red Book, I felt not only my own psychological contents, but those of my patients, my family, and what seemed like the collective psychological atmosphere of Europe during the war. Jung's breakthrough came when he developed active imagination as a method for consciously processing absorbed emotional contents rather than simply carrying them unconsciously. Jung realized that his overwhelming emotional experiences weren't pathological, but evolutionary consciousness attempting to develop beyond current individual limitations to serve collective emotional healing. The integration maintenance protocol. Jung developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy emotional boundaries. Daily solitude for distinguishing your own emotional contents from absorbed material, conscious choice about when and with whom to engage emotionally regular emotional clearing practices to discharge absorbed contents, connection with others capable of providing emotional reality checking, creative expression as outlet for overwhelming emotional input. Jung wrote, the integrated emotionally porous person does not feel less, but feels more consciously, not absorbing less, but transforming more wisely what they absorb. The evolutionary purpose. Jung understood emotional porosity within the context of collective psychological evolution. In The Undiscovered Self, he wrote, the emotionally porous individual serves as an early warning system for collective emotional disturbances that require conscious integration. He believed that people with emotional absorption abilities were sensing psychological patterns that explained collective emotional dysfunction before it became obvious, processing generational trauma that needed conscious healing. Developing emotional capacities beyond current cultural frameworks. Jung's insight. The emotionally sensitive individual feels the collective emotional problems first and most intensely. Their personal symptoms often reflect what the entire culture needs to heal emotionally. The service without martyrdom. Jung's crucial insight was that emotional porosity serves evolution best when it's integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously. The goal isn't to be a martyr to others' emotions, but to be a conscious transformer of collective emotional contents. Jung wrote, the individuated emotionally porous person serves collective emotional healing not by sacrificing their emotional well-being, but by developing their emotional capacities so completely that they become gifts to collective emotional evolution. At the highest level of development, Jung observed individuals who could feel others' emotions without losing themselves, absorb collective emotional contents for conscious transformation rather than unconscious suffering, serve as bridges between individual emotional health and collective emotional healing. The ultimate realization. Remember Jung's patient from 1919, the woman who felt everyone's emotions as her own? After 4 years of working with Jung's integration process, her life transformed completely. She learned to distinguish between her own emotional truth and what she absorbed from others. She found work as a therapist where her emotional porosity became a gift for understanding patients' unspoken emotional states. She built relationships with people who valued her emotional insights rather than unconsciously dumping their unprocessed feelings onto her. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her emotional absorption as a curse and began understanding it as what Jung called a gift requiring conscious development. Jung wrote about her transformation. The patient learned not to feel less, but to feel more consciously, not to absorb less emotional content, but to transform more wisely what she absorbed. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated rather than overwhelming. This represents Jung's most hidden discovery, that some individuals are born with emotional absorption capacities that exceed normal psychological boundaries. This advanced emotional sensitivity will either destroy them through chronic overwhelm or transform them into exactly what collective consciousness needs for emotional healing. Your emotional porosity isn't a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It's an advanced feature of emotional development. You're not broken because you feel everything others reject. You're emotionally ahead of your time. The question isn't whether you should numb your emotional sensitivity to fit in with collective emotional unconsciousness. The question is whether you'll develop the integration skills necessary to transform absorbed emotional contents consciously. Jung's integration method offers a path from dangerous absorption to conscious emotional alchemy, from overwhelming porosity to integrated wisdom, from emotional martyrdom to evolutionary contribution. You were born to feel everything, not to suffer others' unfelt emotions in silence, but to serve collective emotional evolution. The world needs your emotional gifts, but it needs them delivered with the integration, boundaries, and conscious awareness that transform dangerous absorption into collective emotional medicine. Your emotional sensitivity is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your sensitivity is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed emotionally porous individuals were meant to be. Consciousness pioneers preparing humanity for emotional development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. Jung's most terrifying discovery wasn't that some people feel everything. It's that most people who feel everything never learn to transform what they feel consciously. The terror isn't in the absorption itself, but in failing to develop conscious relationship with extraordinary emotional abilities. You are not too sensitive for this world. You are exactly what emotional evolution requires, once you learn to wield your porosity as consciously as Jung learned to wield his. The curse of feeling everything isn't that you feel too much. It's that you might never learn to feel with the integration and wisdom your gifts demand. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the emotionally porous individual, you're part of a rare psychological type that Jung believed essential for collective emotional healing. Share in the comments which type of emotional absorber you are. Your integration journey connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological types that don't fit conventional patterns. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about emotional sensitivity and psychological boundaries, check out my next video. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimensions of consciousness.